Peter Pan. Michael Darling couldn't sleep.
Alice in Wonderland. It was a warm summer day. Alice was lazing on a picnic blanket in the park when she heard a little voice. "Oh dear, I'm late, so very, very late." She looked up and was very surprised to see that it wasn't her sister talking as she first thought. No, it was a white rabbit in a waistcoat with a pocket watch. "That's odd," thought Alice. "A talking rabbit who tells the time?" The rabbit disappeared behind a willow tree, and Alice decided to follow him. Behind the tree was a large hole. Alice leaned in and called out loudly, "Mr. Rabbit, hello!" But she lost her balance and fell forwards into the hole. I know what you're thinking, that she got a face full of mud. But no, believe it or not, she just kept falling and falling. Then after that, she fell some more. Finally, she landed with a big bump on a pile of leaves. She looked around and saw that she was in a large room of an old house. There in the centre of the room was a small table with a bottle. The label simply said, "Drink me." Alice was rather thirsty, so she drank it. A rather silly thing to do, if you ask me. She didn't even check the ingredients. Well, no sooner had the liquid touched her lips than the world around her started to get bigger. "Oh no," thought Alice, "this can't be right." But the world wasn't getting bigger at all. She was getting smaller. In moments, Alice had shrunk right down to the size of a toy doll. "Perhaps that wasn't the best idea," said Alice out loud. But then she happened to notice a tiny cake on the floor hidden underneath the table leg. It had a label on it that read, "Eat me." And being a little girl who clearly doesn't learn from her mistakes, she did. Alice finished the cake just as her head touched the ceiling. The drink had shrunk her down, and now the cake had made her grow as large as the room. She could barely move. Her shoulders were pressed up against the ceiling, her leg was sticking halfway up the chimney, and the small table was now sticking right to her bottom. All of this shrinking and growing was very upsetting, and without really knowing why, Alice suddenly started to cry. Now, there's nothing wrong with a good cry, but being so big, it didn't take too long for the water to be halfway up the wall. The cake's magic was starting to wear off, and Alice began to shrink. This meant she now had to swim through her own salty tears and hang on to the little table which was floating nearby. "Oh, I wish I hadn't cried so much," said Alice. "I shall probably drown in my own tears." Just at that moment, the front door burst open and the pool of tears, along with poor Alice, gushed out into the front garden, completely drowning a whole bed of unsuspected dandelions. Alice sat there on the lawn, soaking wet and rather confused. What a very strange day this was turning out to be. Then she heard a pattering sound in the distance. It was the white rabbit she'd seen earlier. The rabbit called out to her, "You there, girl! Run home and fetch me a pair of gloves and a fan." Well, she was so shocked that she stood up in her wet clothing and ran off in the direction that the rabbit was pointing. Alice ran and ran, finally stopping in a forest of tall grass. She noticed a stream of yellow smoke coming from the top of a large yellow mushroom. She peered over the side and saw a bright blue caterpillar smoking a pipe. "Who are you?" said the caterpillar in a very sleepy voice. "Alice, I think," said Alice. "But I'm not 100% sure. You see, I've been all sorts of shapes and sizes today." "Well, what size do you want to be?" asked the caterpillar. A little larger, I suppose. Why, 3 inches is the perfect height, said the caterpillar, who was exactly 3 inches tall. The caterpillar climbed off the mushroom and crawled away, saying as it went, "One side will make you taller, and the other will make you shorter." Alice guessed the caterpillar meant the mushroom, so she broke off a large piece from either side and carefully nibbled at one and then the other until she was back to her usual height. Alice knocked on the door and found that it was open, so she walked inside. There she saw a duchess sat on a stool, holding a baby, while a cook leaned over a blazing fire stirring a pot of soup. Above the fireplace was a striped cat grinning from ear to ear. "Pig!" shouted the duchess suddenly and threw the baby to Alice. "You nurse it. I must play croquet with the Queen." How rude, thought Alice. But the duchess had already left the room. "I don't know anything about babies," Alice said, looking down into the baby's face. It was then she discovered that it was a pig and not a baby at all. So she set the pig down and watched it trot away. "Cheshire Cat," she said to the grinning cat on the fireplace, "which way do I go from here?" "Depends on where you want to go," said the cat, pointing to the small dirt road outside. "The Hatter and the March Hare are that way." Then, quite surprisingly, the cat began to disappear until nothing but its smile was left. Alice had not gone much farther before she came across a large table set out under a tree. At the table was a March Hare and a Hatter having tea and cake. A dormouse sat between them, fast asleep and snoring. "No room, no room," they cried when they saw Alice coming. "There's plenty of room," said Alice, and sat down in an armchair at one end of the table. The Hatter took out his pocket watch and turned to Alice. "What day of the month is it?" Alice thought for a moment and said, "The 4th." "Wrong!" shouted the Hatter. "It's precisely tea o'clock, which means it's time for last Wednesday's dinner." Alice was so confused. "I don't think—" "Then you shouldn't talk," said the Hatter before she could finish. "What a perfectly rude thing to say," said Alice, getting up from the table and walking off into the woods. Alice noticed that one of the trees had a door on its enormous trunk. She opened the door and walked inside, only to find herself in a beautiful garden. A large rose tree stood near the entrance. The roses were white, but Alice noticed a gardener, who looked a lot like a playing card, was painting the flowers red. "Excuse me," said Alice, "but why are you doing that?" "The Queen wants them red," said the gardener. "If she finds out they're white, she'll cut me head off." There was the sound of marching boots on gravel and 10 soldiers, also shaped as playing cards, appeared. After them came the King and the Queen of Hearts, followed by the same white rabbit that Alice had seen earlier. The Queen stopped and stared at Alice. "What is your name, child?" "Alice, Your Majesty." "And who is this?" asked the Queen, pointing to the gardener. "How should I know?" said Alice honestly. The Queen's face turned bright red, and she screamed, "Off with her head! Off!" "Nonsense," said Alice, and the Queen fell silent. Said the Queen. "Do you play croquet?" Alice had never seen such a strange-looking game of croquet. The balls were hedgehogs, the mallets were flamingos, and the soldiers had to double themselves up and stand on their hands and feet to make arches. The Queen never stopped arguing with the other players. Every minute she would shout, off with his or her head to someone or other. This meant that very soon the only players left were the king, the queen, and Alice. The queen dropped her flamingo, grabbed Alice by the arm, and began walking her through the castle grounds. She started talking about a mock turtle. Alice was very confused. "He's sad because he used to be a real turtle," said the queen. "But enough of this. Time for heads to roll." The queen took her place on the throne beside the King of Hearts, and Alice stood in a large crowd. A knave was brought forward, and everyone fell silent when the White Rabbit blew loudly on a trumpet. Then he cleared his throat and announced, "The Queen of Hearts, she made some tarts all on a summer's day. The Knave of Hearts, he stole those tarts and took them all away." The crowd all gasped in horror. "Step forward, Hatter," said the White Rabbit. Alice recognised him as the same one who'd been quite rude to Alice earlier. "Witness, please take off your hat," ordered the king. "But it isn't my hat," said the Hatter. "Hat thief," the king explained. "Off with his head," shouted the queen. But before anything could be done, the Hatter ran off. It was at this moment that Alice felt herself beginning to grow larger. The mushroom was wearing off, and she was returning to her normal size. "Next witness," said the king, and the White Rabbit shouted at the top of his voice. "Step forward, Alice." Alice now was so large that she knocked over a whole crowd of people. The king looked very annoyed and called out, "I decree that all persons more than a mile high must leave the court at once." Everybody looked up at Alice. "But I'm not a mile high, you silly king." Then she noticed a tray full of hearts on the table at the back of the hall. Are these the tarts you're looking for?" "Hold your tongue," shouted the queen, turning quite purple. "I will not," said Alice strongly. "Off with your head! I mean her head!" screamed the queen. But the soldiers froze on the spot. Alice was now full size and towering above them all. "You're nothing but a pack of cards!" Alice shouted angrily. At this point, the soldier cards came flying at her face and covered her eyes, and she screamed. All of a sudden, Alice found herself lying on her picnic blanket with her head in her sister's lap. "Wake up, Alice," said her sister. "You've been asleep." "That's a relief," said Alice. "I've had such a strange dream." She told her sister about her whole adventure. "That is very strange," said Alice's sister, "but it is getting late." Alice noticed that the sun was beginning to set, so they quickly packed up their things and walked off through the park and all the way home. Strange, thought Alice. It all seemed so real. What she didn't notice was a small white rabbit watching her from behind a nearby willow tree. It's possible he was wearing a waistcoat. And was that something shiny in his furry paw? A tiny silver pocket watch, perhaps? What do you think?